on to the second part of theme 4 from NCERT Class 12th History. In the previous class, we had seen how Buddha got the enlightenment and Lord Mahavir's preaching. Both of them actually had their teachings orally, and it was after their demise that their preachings were converted into text. For example, in Buddhism, it were the Pitikas, the three Pitikas, the Sutta Pitaka, Vinay Pitaka, and the Abhidham Pitaka that we have studied. Now, talking about the next interesting architectural structure, which are stupas. Now, Buddhist literatures have been mentioned several Chaitya. Chaitya works or Chaitya have been derived from Chait, which means a funeral pyre, and this talks about extension of a mold. Now, stupas are the places where the remains of the Lord were kept, and these stupas are the ones where the bodily remains were kept, or the objects that were used by them were kept in place. So these places were called as stupas. They were created as mold structures, and they were associated during the time of Buddhism, even before the Buddhism, during the pre-Buddhist time. So Buddhist text known as Ashokavadana talks about how Ashok actually distributed the remains to the people in different parts, and as a result, Bhairut, Sanchi, and Sarnath were built. So if you can see on the map, Bhairut, Sarnath, and Sanchi were built by the remains which were distributed by King Ashoka, and this was when the stupas were built. Now, if we talk about the life of Gautam Buddha, from the map here, we can understand he was born in the region of Lumbini. He attained enlightenment at Bodh Gaya. His first preaching was at Sarnath, and Nibna, what we call as Nirvan, was at Kushinagar. So then again, the pillar to mark the Buddhism was erected by Ashoka at Lumbini. So those were some of the important places on map. In the south, Nasik, Junar, Karel, and then Ajanta Ellora caves are interesting. It is interesting, the one who created the Ajanta structures later, when came out and saw back the structure, said, "Oh wow, this is created by me." So those were kind of magnificent structures that were built by the architects during that time. So the constructions of them have been important. The contributions of the kings during that time, for example, the contribution of Satavahana kingdom is extremely important. Various guilds also contributed to the ivory which was used in creation of the gateways of Sanchi. The Sanchi gateways were made of ivory. The contributions done by bhikkhus and bhikkhunis were also important. Now, stupa is a Sanskrit word which comes from or is derived as heap, and this is semicircular. It is also called as a shape of anda, and this were initially as a semicircular mold. Later on, there were square shapes that were also seen. Above the semicircular shape, which was called as anda, was the harmika. Harmika is the balcony type structure, and this is the place where the god actually resides. So it is called as the adobe of God. And from the center of the harmika, there is a flag like thing, and this is called as the mast or the yashti. And this yashti has the chhatri or the umbrella. So the stupa, the heap, harmika, the balcony, and on top of that, the mast or the flag, which is called as yashti, is one of the major structures. Now, be it Sanchi, be it Bhairut, the most classic thing is the railings towards or surrounding to the stupa. Now, on all the sides of it is a railing which is a stone railing, and this is an idea to separate the holy place from the worldly place. So separation of the holy region and the worldly region was one of the important ideas. On the four sides were four entries. The idea was, if anyone who would enter this stupa would enter from the eastern gateway, move in a clockwise direction following the sun, and would complete the mold while always keeping the mold towards the right of the person. So that was the way it was designed. Now these sculptures, be it Sanchi, be it Behrut, were architectural marvels and similar structures in the south in Amravati. However, the structure of Amravati was not as expected, like it was not excavated as Sanchi was. There was another important sculpture which was Shahaji ki Dheri, and Shahaji ki Dheri lies in Peshawar, which is the present day Pakistan, where again Buddhism saw its extreme roots. So in 1796, one of the local Rajas built a temple, wanted to build a temple on the ruins of the Amravati. Now Amravati, while he was building the temple there, he wanted to take the stones, and he decided to take the stones to build the temple from the ruins of the Amravati. Some year later, a British official calling Mackenzie also visited and found several pieces there that were never reported or published. Similarly, Walter Elliot actually came in 1854. He was the commissioner of Guntur in Andhra Pradesh, and he collected the samples from Amravati, and then he took them away to Madras. Now, since he took these samples taken by Walter Elliot were known as Elliot marbles during that time. And then during 1950s, some of the slabs from Amravati were also taken to Asiatic Society of Bengal at Calcutta. They were also taken to the office in Madras. Some were taken to London, and as a result, the original sanctity of Amravati could not be maintained. The stupa could not be maintained. However, one of the reasons why we say Sanchi was well preserved in contrast to Amravati was probably Amravati was discovered much earlier. Sanchi was discovered relatively later. And again, when the Sanchi was discovered, 3 of the 4 gateways were still standing. That means it was relatively more intact and more well preserved as the case of Amravati. The Amravati structure was more defunct, and ruins were found more commonly in contrast to what was seen in Sanchi, and as a result the Sanchi was relatively well preserved. And H.H. Cole during that time well said that it is important that if you want to take to other nations or other parts of the country, it's important that you take the plaster cast copies rather than the original form, because original form would be required to help understand the beauty of the region. The next is the sculptures. So far we have seen that sculptures were removed from the stupa and transported to Europe. Now these sculptures talked about the various storytellings, various aspects. There is one very interesting sculpture, as you can see in the picture here. This is the sculpture at Sanchi, and this explains the Vesantra Jataka. Vesantra Jataka, now a common man would, if see this picture, say that it talks about a rural life. But in natural aspect, this extract from the Sanchi Stupa of the Vesantara Jataka story says that this was a king, and this king was so generous that he gave everything to the common people, and with his wife and children took a way to the forest. And this whole Jataka story is depicted in the form of picture depicting and elaborating that story. The next is there were many sculptures. For example, Buddha's attainment of enlightenment is one such sculpture which has been very popular, where empty seat has been shown. Now this empty seat indicates that Buddha is meditating. Then again, the stupa actually represents the Parinirban, and then there was a wheel. Now this wheel is another important symbol of the sermons given by Gautam Buddha. So there is tree which symbolizes the life of Gautam Buddha as Bodhi tree. So there are various sculptures that signify. Now here there is a lady, the idea is this lady is holding a tree, something like that, what we common man would understand. But in Sanskrit this is Shala Bhajanika, and this Shal Bhajnika is actually a structure, a auspicious symbol where this lady, if touches the tree, that tree would start to flower and give fruits. So this is again considered as one of the decorations of the stupas. It is also considered as one of the auspicious figures in Buddhist texts, and similarly there are sculptures where animal figures are shown. For example, elephant is commonly shown in Buddhist texts. Now, elephant, horse, monkey, other animals are shown in most of the Jataka stories, but elephant actually signifies strength and wisdom. So, each of the figures, the historians, when they read it carefully, they understand that they signify some important message to the common man. It was not just the carvings. Even the paintings are important. So paintings, as we see in the Ajanta caves, which were actually talking about a colorful painting, the stories of the Jataka, and sometimes had a three-dimensional quality, which was a very unique aspect, and these colorful paintings are still preserved in the Ajanta Ellora caves, and these paintings are again extremely naturalistic. There is another sculpture, as you can see here. The woman is surrounded by elephants and lotus, and it seems that the elephants are sprinkling water. Now some historians say that this figure is of Maya, which that is the mother of Gautam Buddha. The others say this is Gajalakshmi, one of the goddesses in Buddhism, which indicates good fortune and is associated with elephants. So again, each sculpture have their own association. Similarly, James Ferguson, as we said while was studying, considered Sanchi as the center of the tree and the serpent worship. Now, in this Buddhism itself, there were two important sects, the Mahayana and the Hinayan. The Hinayan, the older version, the Mahayana, the newer vehicle or the greater vehicle as it was talked as. So Hinayan or Theravadas were considered as lesser vehicles. Those who were considered as other Buddhists were considered as followers of Hinayan or Theravada or called as Theravas, and the main ones considered themselves as Mahayana or Mahayana Buddhism. Now, the idea was Buddha was regarded as human being who attained enlightenment through the meditation and the efforts that he had done in his life. And these ideas of savior emerged over the time. And this was one of the ways that was explained that one could attain salvation. However, at the same time, Bodhisattva developed, and these Bodhisattvas talked about the people who were deeply compassionate, and they were ready to abandon the world and ready to sacrifice or compromise their life to help others. So they were extremely compassionate people, and these were called as Bodhisattva. So that was one of the segments under Mahayana. But it was not just the Buddhism. The Puranic Hinduism also had two important cults, the Vaishnavism and Shaivism. Vaishnavism were those who believed in Vishnu, and Shaivisms were those who believed in Shiva or Ling, the Shaivites and the Vaishnavites. Now, Vishnus, those who followed Vishnus, believed that there were more than 10 avatars of Vishnu. Now, each region locally had different avatars or different, we could say, forms of Vishnu that was worshipped. Again, how these deities interacted with the priests, the common people, the layman, the women, was again one of the messages that were given through the Puranic Hinduism and the Hindu texts. So, for example, Vasudev Krishna is one of the deities which are worshipped in the region of Mathura. In the south, we have similar deities, but they are worshipped with other names. So, there is where we understand that various sects evolved within the major two divisions which were there. Again, temple building was important. So at the time Sanchi Stupa was seen, there were the first temples of Hindu gods and goddesses that the temples of Hindu gods and goddesses that were also seen simultaneously. So at that time, the place where the gods and goddesses were kept were known as Garbhagriha or the major room, and this was usually having a structure later with a erect tall structure which was known as Shikara, which focused that below the Shikara is the central shrine or the Garbhagriha which is located. Later temples had huge walls, the gateways which were erected, and unique features. Mahabalipuram is one with a single rock cut structure. Now Mahabalipuram is one such unique structures. There were others where there were places which were carved from a single rock, which we call as artificial caves, and these were again important. So in the 3rd century BC, temples were built by the orders of Ashoka, and they were the Ajivika sects, those who were the fatalists, who believed things happened as predetermined. And then the tradition culminated during the 8th century, where the carvings were seen of the entire temples. For example, Kailashnath temple, which talks or reveals about the Shiva. Now, we as a human being cannot see everything. We can study only the preserves, the remains, what are there, and based on the remains that are left, we study history. So we know history only with the elements that are left so far. Now Greeks, actually the Indo-Greek rulers believed that Indian architecture was inferior to the Greek, except for the architectures that they saw from Buddha. So Buddha's sculptures that were built were considered as similar to the Greek sculptures, mainly in the clothing and the hairstyle, and therefore they considered the figures of Buddha as one of the best representations of the history and fine pieces of history, because they were very similar to the Greek models, and Indo-Greek rulers established this, and therefore they were considered as art masterpieces during that time. However, Mahabalipuram, which is the rock cut statue figure, as we said, has numerous stories. For example, some believe that when Ganga descended, this was the rock cleft where the Ganga left, and this river is the point, this Mahabalipuram is the point where river actually moved. Some other epics like Mahabharata talked about the penance of Arjun on the river banks for acquiring the arms, and this was at Mahabalipuram. So there are various stories which are associated with each place, but ultimately what we understand or what we know about history is what historians tell us through the Jataka stories, through the paintings, the carvings, the sculptures, and the interpretation of the archaeologist and the historian. We understand what the history was, but definitely we have understood it only to the depth. We have seen the sculptures, but there have been numerous things which are still unexplored, unearthed, and we even don't have access to a huge history till now.